The first time I saw the gate, it was love at first sight. Not the mushy Nicholas Sparks kind of love you feel for a person, or even the deep spiritual love you might feel for a perfectly crafted carnitas burrito. This was purer, more elemental. It was the love a man who designs user interfaces for a living feels for a perfect, elegant, single-click solution to a complex problem. The problem? A sheer 200-foot drop of prime California cliffside. The solution? A simple, weathered wooden gate at the absolute edge of my new property. It was made of sturdy redwood, silvered by years of salt spray, with a simple iron latch. It wasn't just wood and hinges. It was a portal, my own private Narnia, but with more carabiners and significantly less theological allegory. Below it lay a pristine, secluded cove, a geological masterpiece that offered some of the best and most private climbing routes in the entire state. I'd just sunk a frankly irresponsible portion of my tech startup money into this glass and steel box of a house, perched in a neighborhood so exclusive the welcome basket probably contained bearer bonds and a list of approved beige paint colors. I didn't buy it for the infinity pool or the wine cellar that could double as a nuclear bunker. I bought it for the view and, more specifically, for the gate. The realtor, a woman named Skye, whose teeth were an unsettling shade of white, had called it a designated emergency access point. I called it my front door. It saved me a 45-minute drive to the public access trail, a soul-crushing crawl through tourist traffic that was the antithesis of the freedom I sought on the rock face. With the gate, my commute from couch to cliff was about 90 seconds. It was the pinnacle of efficiency, a monument to elegant design, the first sign that my utopian existence was built on a foundation of sand had a name: Brenda. She materialized on my doorstep 2 days after I'd moved in. A woman built like a filing cabinet and holding a clipboard with the same grim reverence a medieval knight might hold a holy relic. Her hair was a perfect, immobile helmet of blonde ambition, and her eyes, the color of a washed-out sky, scanned my property like a T-800 searching for Sarah Connor. "Leo?" she asked. It wasn't a question so much as an accusation, as if my very existence was a violation of some unseen ordinance. "That's me," I said, deploying a friendly, non-threatening smile. It was a smile I'd perfected for venture capital meetings, designed to convey both confidence and a charming lack of guile. It bounced off Brenda's stony expression with a dull, unsatisfying thud. "Brenda, HOA president." She gestured vaguely at the multi-million-dollar homes surrounding us with her clipboard. "I'm conducting the biannual property compliance review." "Fantastic. Welcome," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Can I get you something? Water, kombucha, a Xanax?" She ignored the offer entirely. Her gaze swept past my tastefully minimalist landscaping and zeroed in on my beloved gate. A tiny, almost imperceptible tightening occurred around her mouth. "Item 1, she said, her pen making a sharp, decisive tick on her paper. "The unapproved access point." I felt a slight chill, the kind you get when your code compiles with a single cryptic error message. "Ah, the rescue gate," I said, keeping my tone light. "It's a beauty, isn't it? Such a time saver. Wonderfully efficient." "It's a liability," she corrected, her voice as devoid of warmth as a server room. "As per HOA Bylaw 7, subsection C, paragraph 4, all property boundaries must be secured to prevent unauthorized ingress and egress. It's a security risk, a temptation for teenagers, and an insurance nightmare." I blinked slowly, processing the raw, uncut bureaucracy of her statement. "It's for rescuing people," I explained, as if to a small child. "The clue is in the name. Fire department, paramedics, clumsy climbers like me who might forget to clip in properly after a particularly long day of debugging. "The rules," she said, finally meeting my gaze with the unblinking intensity of a predator that subsists entirely on joy. "Are the rules." She made another tick on her clipboard, turned on her sensible shoed heel, and marched away, leaving a faint scent of hairspray and righteous indignation in her wake. Now I'm a reasonable guy. My entire career is built on logic, on A/B testing, on finding elegant, data-driven solutions to complex problems. So I tried logic. That evening, I composed a masterpiece of an email. It was polite, deferential, and impeccably researched. I included links to the county's own emergency access regulations, a PDF of the original property survey that clearly marked the gate's purpose, and even a charmingly written anecdote I found online about a climber in Colorado who was saved from a nasty case of hypothermia by a similar access point. I signed it, "Warmly, your new neighbor, Leo." Her reply arrived in my inbox exactly 3 minutes later. The subject line was simply, "The Gate." The body of the email, written in a 16-point, blood-red Comic Sans font that was an act of aggression in itself, contained a single sentence. "The matter is closed." The next morning I woke up, pulled on my climbing shorts, and headed out for my morning constitutional on the cliff face. But something was wrong. A new object had entered the landscape, glinting in the morning sun. It was a padlock. Not a normal, everyday padlock. This thing was the size of a small grapefruit, a brutalist masterpiece of hardened steel chained through the latch of my gate. It was a beautiful piece of hardware, I had to admit, gleaming, industrial, and utterly unapologetic. It didn't just lock the gate, it made a statement. It screamed, "I am the final, unassailable word." I looked at the lock. I looked at the shimmering ocean 200 feet below. I thought about the 45-minute drive, the traffic, the lost climbing time, and I thought, "Oh, Brenda, you sweet summer child, you have no idea who you're dealing with." And lesser man might have considered bolt cutters. But that was Brenda's move. Brute force? Obvious. It lacked finesse. It was an inelegant solution. Instead, I drove to the local high-end hardware store, the kind of place that sells $100 hammers and artisanal wood screws. I'm a tech guy, but I appreciate the analog world. The satisfying heft of a well-balanced tool, the clean metallic scent of machine oil. I didn't buy a bolt cutter. I bought a set of high-quality quick-release hinge pins. It took me all of 10 minutes that afternoon. With a small hammer and a punch tool, I carefully tapped out the gate's existing hinge pins. I slipped my new, much more efficient ones into place. From the outside, the gate looked exactly the same. The monstrous padlock was still there, a silent, impotent monument to Brenda's authority. But now, all one had to do was slide up the two small, nearly invisible pins, and the entire gate simply lifted off its hinges. It was a backdoor exploit, a system vulnerability only I knew about. I wasn't damaging property, I was improving its functionality. User-centered design at its finest. To add a bit of flair, I left a neatly printed note under the padlock, tucked into a small plastic baggie to protect it from the sea spray. It read, "Upgraded for efficiency. You're welcome. Leo." Brenda's response was a masterclass in passive aggression. She didn't confront me. She didn't email me. The next day, a formal, notarized letter was taped to my front door with an aggressive amount of packing tape. It detailed my unauthorized modification of common area adjacent structures and levied a fine of $500. My friendly note was gone. And the hinges? They were no longer hinges. They were solid, immovable lumps of metal. She had someone come and seal them with the unmistakable, pock-marked ugliness of a fresh weld. The gate was no longer a gate. It was just a section of fence that happened to be shaped like a gate. I stood there, looking at the crude, angry welds, and I felt a shift in my soul. This was no longer about convenience. It was no longer about climbing. This was about principles. It was about elegant design versus brutalist lockdown. It was about innovation versus stagnation. The war had begun. "You're an idiot," Chad said, not for the first time that week. He was sprawled on my ridiculously expensive Italian leather sofa, nursing a craft beer and looking out at the Pacific. Chad, my best friend since college and my long-suffering climbing partner, was the yin to my yang. Where I saw a challenge, a puzzle to be solved, he saw a potential restraining order and a series of increasingly awkward conversations with law enforcement. "It's the principle of the thing, man," I argued, pacing back and forth on the Persian rug that had cost more than my first car. "She welded the gate. Welded it. What kind of monster welds a rescue gate shut? That's like putting a child-proof cap on an EpiPen." "A crazy person, Leo. An incredibly motivated, rule-obsessed crazy person," Chad reasoned, taking a long sip of his beer. "Which is precisely why you should just let it go. Disengage. We can drive to the public trail. It's a nice drive. We can listen to a podcast." I stopped pacing and stared at him, aghast. "A nice drive? It's 45 minutes of my life, Chad. 45 minutes I'll never get back, each way. That's an hour and a half of precious verticality I'm losing every single time I want to climb. It's a catastrophic loss of efficiency. Do you know how many lines of code I could write in an hour and a half?" "Probably a lot," he conceded. "But none of them will get you arrested." I ignored him and stared out the floor-to-ceiling window. The cliff face was bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon. The rock was practically calling to me, whispering sweet nothings about heel hooks and dinos. And between me and that sweet, rocky embrace stood one immovable object: Brenda, the human firewall. And then it hit me, an idea so simple, so audacious, so exquisitely, beautifully insane, that it bloomed in my mind fully formed and glorious in its absurdity. It was the kind of idea that only comes from a perfect storm of frustration, disposable income, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how normal, well-adjusted people solve interpersonal conflicts. "I'm not going to drive around," I announced, a slow grin spreading across my face. "I'm going to go over." Chad looked confused. "Over Brenda's house? Leo, that's definitely breaking and entering, and probably several other felonies." No, not over her house," I said, my fingers already flying across the keyboard of my laptop. "Over the whole problem. I'm going to innovate my way out of this situation. I'm going to apply a disruptive technological solution to a legacy analog problem." "You're talking like you're pitching to a VC again." "Just watch," I said. A few clicks later, I found it. A local charter company specializing in executive transport and aerial photography. Their website was a little cheesy, but their fleet was impressive. And right there, on the Our Aircraft page, was my salvation. A gleaming, beautiful Bell 412 helicopter. Chad stared at the screen, then back at me, his mouth slightly agape. "You're going to, what, airdrop in like you're in a video game?" "Not airdrop," I corrected him, puffing out my chest slightly. "Rappel. It's classier. More hands-on." The next morning was perfect. The sun was bright, the sky was a deep, cloudless blue, and the wind was calm. It was a perfect day for climbing, and, as it turned out, a perfect day for a low-altitude tactical insertion. As the rhythmic whump-whump-whump of the Bell 412 grew from a distant thrum to a house-rattling roar, I could see Brenda's curtains twitching next door. I was already in my climbing harness, helmet on, grinning like a boy on Christmas morning, who had just been given a pony made of rocket parts. The pilot, a grizzled guy named Frank with a handlebar mustache that could have its own zip code, looked back at me from the cockpit as we hovered over my property line. The noise was immense. "You're sure about this, kid?" he yelled over the rotor wash, his voice crackling through the headset. "This is a new one for me, and I once flew a guy's prize-winning pig to a barbecue in Fresno." "Never been more sure of anything in my life, Frank," I yelled back, giving him a hearty thumbs up. As we steadied ourselves 100 feet above my backyard, I clipped my rappel device onto the rope that Frank's co-pilot had anchored to a hard point on the helicopter's floor. The world opened up beneath me. The shimmering blue of the Pacific, the rugged beauty of the cliffs, my ridiculous glass house, and Brenda's slightly less ridiculous, but much more beige house next door. With a deep breath, I swung my legs out, gave the fuselage a shove, and leaned back into the open air. The wind tore at me, a physical presence, and for a moment it was just pure, unadulterated 100-octane adrenaline. Then I looked down and saw her. Brenda. Standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, her pink chenille bathrobe pulled tight around her filing cabinet frame, her face a mask of pure, uncomprehending rage. Her mouth was open, probably screaming obscenities that were lost in the thunder of the rotors. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I started my descent, a smooth, controlled rappel, feeding the rope through the device with practiced ease. As I went, I made sure to stop for a moment, lock off the rope, and give her a jaunty little wave. The fallout was, as they say in the startup world, immediate and disruptive. By the time I had finished a magnificent 3-hour climb, and Frank was hoisting me back up to the heavens on the end of the rope, I could see the flashing red and blue lights of a police car pulling up to Brenda's house. I had Frank land the chopper in a nearby park clearing I had prearranged with the charter company, for a small inconvenience fee, of course. I thanked him profusely, tipped him an amount that made his mustache twitch with joy, and drove my Tesla the 2 minutes back to my house. Officers Miller and Davis were waiting for me in my driveway. Miller was the older one, with a classic cop mustache and a face that looked like it had been permanently carved into an expression of weary disappointment with humanity. Davis was younger, greener, and was trying very, very hard not to smile. "Sir," Miller began, his voice as flat as a week-old soda, "we received a complaint." "Let me guess," I said, leaning casually against the driver's side door of my car. "Brenda? Something about a noise disturbance?" "She mentioned something about unauthorized airspace violations and a campaign of aerial intimidation," Davis supplied, reading with relish from his small notepad. "Those are her words, not mine." "Is that a crime?" I asked innocently. "Being intimidating from the air? I mean, I was over my own property for the actual rappel. The approach and departure vectors were within FAA guidelines for this altitude. And it was my helicopter. For the hour, anyway." Miller sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul, a sigh that carried the weight of 1,000 domestic disputes and petty squabbles. "Look, son, we can't tell you how to spend your money. And technically, as far as we can tell, you haven't actually broken any laws. But could you, not?" "I'll try my best, officer," I said with a sincerity that was, at best, questionable. They left, but I knew it wasn't over. Brenda, a creature of rules and regulations, did what she did best. She weaponized the HOA. An emergency meeting was called. It was held in her garage, which was so clean, so organized, with tools hung on a pegboard in order of size and function, that it looked less like a garage and more like a surgical theater for lawnmowers. I came prepared. I had a full PowerPoint presentation on my MacBook. Titled Innovative Access Solutions for the Modern Homeowner, It detailed the profound inefficiency of the 45-minute drive versus the elegant 3-minute helicopter rappel. I had charts comparing fuel consumption and time cost. I had graphs illustrating the psychological benefits of immediate access to recreational activities. I even had an embedded video of my rappel set to an inspiring orchestral score. It didn't matter. Brenda didn't have a PowerPoint. She had fear. The other homeowners, a collection of surgeons, corporate lawyers, and miscellaneous rich people who just wanted a quiet life, were terrified of her. They had seen what she did to my gate. They had heard the stories. They didn't want their tastefully minimalist rock gardens declared non-compliant or their expensive imported garden gnomes confiscated. A new rule was drafted and passed in under 15 minutes. The Brenda Bylaw, I called it in my head. Effective immediately. No private aircraft landings, takeoffs, or personnel deployments via rope or ladder within the community for recreational purposes. Brenda looked at me from across the garage, her eyes gleaming with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. She had won. She had closed my loophole. I just smiled back at her. She had won the battle of the air, yes. But the war was far from over. I was just getting started. If I couldn't go over, then I would have to go down. You know, Chad said a few days later, as we stared at the offending cliff face from my living room, you could just move. And let her win? Never, I declared. That's not a viable exit strategy. The user base, that's me, would be completely unsatisfied with that outcome. Okay, well, how about tunneling? He suggested, only half joking. You could go full El Chapo. I bet there's a startup for that. Tunnel as a service. He meant it as a joke, but it sparked something. Tunneling was too messy, too subterranean. I wanted something bold, something visible, something that was both a practical solution and a towering, multi-ton monument to my spite. I found them online. A small, local construction company with a website that looked like it had been designed in 1998. Their name was Sticks and Stones Custom Builds. Their portfolio was eclectic. A lot of fancy redwood decks, some weird-looking geodesic dome gazebos, and one elaborate treehouse that looked suspiciously like the Millennium Falcon. They were perfect. I called them. The man who answered the phone was Sticks. He talked a mile a minute, a whirlwind of folksy charm and construction jargon. I arranged for them to come by the next day. Sticks was a wiry, hyperactive man, with a pencil permanently perched behind his ear and an aura of relentless, almost unnerving optimism. His partner, Stones, was his polar opposite. Stones was a mountain of a man, with a thick beard and arms like tree trunks, who communicated primarily through a series of elaborate grunts and the occasional, surprisingly insightful sketch on a crumpled napkin. I led them to the edge of the cliff, the site of my woes. So, I said, gesturing down the sheer 200-foot rock face. I'm thinking of a staircase. Sticks squinted, his head cocked to one side. A staircase, that, right, okay, we can do stairs. We do great stairs. Redwood, composite, got a lovely new Brazilian hardwood that holds up great in the salt air. No, I said, a visionary gleam in my eye that I'm sure made them deeply uncomfortable. I'm thinking minimalist James Bond villain's escape route. All galvanized steel and reinforced glass and sharp, clean angles. Something that says, I respect nature, but I'm also not afraid to bolt things to it with extreme prejudice. Sticks looked at me, then at the cliff, then back at me. I could see the words absolutely not forming on his lips. He was about to tell me it was impossible, insane, a one-way ticket to bankruptcy court. But before he could speak, Stones, who had been silent up to this point, pulled a crumpled napkin from his pocket. With a stubby carpenter's pencil that looked like a toothpick in his massive hand, he began to sketch. In less than a minute, he had drawn a breathtaking series of switchbacks, a cantilevered viewing platform, a sleek, almost invisible structure that hugged the cliff face like a metallic vine. It was perfect. It was the physical manifestation of my ID. Styx peered over his partner's shoulder at the napkin. His eyes went wide. A slow, conspiratorial grin spread across his face. "Huh," he said. "Well, I'll be damned." He looked up at me, his optimism now dialed up to 11. "Operation Downward Dog is a go," he declared. The name stuck. The day the first flatbed truck arrived, carrying several tons of galvanized steel beams, Brenda was waiting. The arrival of heavy construction equipment in our pristine neighborhood was like a bat signal for her. She marched out of her house, clipboard in hand, her face set in a grim mask of determination. She was in her element. "Do you have a permit for this monstrosity?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the morning air with the sharpness of a circular saw. Styx, bless his cheerful, talkative heart, just beamed at her. "Morning, ma'am. Beautiful day for some light construction, isn't it?" he chirped. "And yes, indeedy, we do. Permit B749, approved by the County Planning Department last Tuesday. Signed, sealed, and delivered right here." He produced a plastic-sleeved document from his truck with the flourish of a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat. Brenda snatched it, her eyes scanning the text for any loophole, any mistake, any misplaced comma that she could use to shut us down. Finding none, she moved on to her next line of attack. "This is a residential area. What about the noise, the disruption?" "All work will be conducted between the legally mandated hours of 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., ma'am," Styx said, his cheerfulness utterly impervious to her hostility. "We're very respectful of the community. Stones here even uses a special rubber mallet for the quiet parts." Stones grunted in affirmation. The construction began, and so did Brenda's campaign of low-grade psychological warfare. She documented our every move with a long-lens camera from her window. She filed a formal complaint about the placement of our porta-potty, claiming it obstructs the panoramic view from my breakfast nook. She contested the soil erosion report our engineers had submitted. She even, and I am not making this up, tried to have Stones cited for having a tattoo on his forearm that she deemed intimidating and potentially gang-related. It was a poorly drawn anchor with the word "Mom" written in a ribbon underneath it. I, of course, was not one to take this lying down. I was a tech entrepreneur. I understood asymmetrical warfare. My counteroffensives were subtle, yet effective. I had a professional-grade outdoor sound system installed and created a special Spotify playlist I called Construction Classics. At 8:01 a.m. every single morning, the dulcet tones of Wrecking Ball by Miley Cyrus would echo through the canyon, followed by a carefully curated selection of AC/DC, Metallica, and the occasional random blast of Baby Shark, just to keep her on her toes. Then came the drone. I bought a top-of-the-line quadcopter with a high-resolution camera and began filming the construction for a documentary I was making on the project. The drone, quite coincidentally, had an excellent zoom lens and always seemed to be hovering in the air whenever Brenda was engaged in some act of petty sabotage, like accidentally aiming her powerful lawn sprinklers at our freshly poured concrete footings, or mistakenly tossing her grass clippings over the fence onto our neatly stacked materials. This, of course, led to another visit from our favorite law enforcement duo. "A drone, son?" Miller asked, his sigh now a permanent, integral part of his respiratory cycle. It was a sigh that contained multitudes. "She's saying you're spying on her. Invasion of privacy." I'm documenting my private property and the legal construction project taking place upon it, officer, I said, showing him the crystal-clear 4K footage on my phone. See? All focused on the staircase. The beautiful craftsmanship of sticks and stones. Oh, and look at that! There's Brenda kicking over our safety cones. What a rascal! Miller rubbed his temples, a gesture I was becoming intimately familiar with. Just try to keep the peace, both of you, please. My retirement is in 17 months. The project was nearing completion. The staircase was no longer a napkin sketch. It was a work of art. It was everything I had dreamed of, sleek, audacious, and a giant steel and glass middle finger pointed directly at my neighbor's breakfast nook. Brenda was growing desperate. I could see it in the way she paced her perfectly manicured lawn, the way her curtains twitched with increasing frequency. She knew she was losing. Her bylaws were powerless against my permits. Her complaints were neutered by my video evidence. And that's when she crossed the line between petty, neighborhood tyrant and bona fide, premeditated criminal. One night, a real California gusher of a storm rolled in. The wind howled like a banshee, and the rain came down in horizontal sheets, rattling against my giant glass windows. Under the cover of that profound darkness and the roar of the storm, Brenda made her move. She snuck onto my property, clad in a dark raincoat, a small but determined shadow against the raging elements. She was no engineer, but she knew what looked important. She found a large, heavy-duty turnbuckle, a critical component connecting one of the main support struts of the cantilevered platform to a deep-set rock anchor. With a crowbar she'd brought from her pristine garage and a great deal of grunting effort, she worked at it, twisting and prying until the main pin popped loose. She probably thought it would just cause a delay, a costly bit of damage, another bureaucratic hurdle for me to overcome. She had no idea what she had really done. She hadn't just vandalized my project. She had set a trap. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind that fresh, electric, post-rain smell and a sky so brilliantly clear it hurt to look at. I was practically vibrating with excitement. Operation Downward. Dog was complete. The final bolts had been tightened the day before. It was time for the maiden voyage. "You should wait," Chad said, his voice laced with his usual brand of cautious pessimism. He'd come over to witness the grand opening. "You know, let sticks and stones do a final safety check. Kick the tires, or the steel beams, whatever." "Safety check? I am the safety check," I scoffed, already clipping a safety line from my harness to the newly installed railing. This was just a formality. The thing was built like a battleship. "Come on, it'll be great. You can film the first descent for my documentary." I swung my leg over the railing and stepped onto the top stair. The steel was cool and solid under the soles of my approach shoes. The view was even better than I had imagined. With each step down, the world expanded, the coastline stretching out for miles in either direction. It felt like walking on air. I was about halfway down, just above the main viewing platform that jutted out over the abyss when I heard it. A sound you never, ever want to hear when you're suspended over a 200-foot drop. A sharp, metallic crack that echoed off the cliff face like a gunshot. The world tilted violently. The section of staircase I was standing on dropped out from under me. For a single, terrifying, crystal-clear split second, I was Wile E. Coyote, suspended in midair, looking at the camera with a sense of bemused horror. Then gravity, that cruel mistress, remembered who was boss and reasserted her authority with extreme prejudice. I plunged, a strangled yell tearing from my throat. The fall was only about 15 feet, but it felt like a mile. Then, a sudden, violent, bone-jarring jolt as my safety line snapped taut. My left shoulder screamed in protest as it was wrenched from its socket with a sickening wet pop. My right ankle, swinging on the pendulum of my body, slammed against the jagged rock face with a crunch that I felt more than heard. And then silence. Just the gentle sea breeze, the distant cry of a gull, and the sound of my own ragged, panicked breathing. I was dangling, a human piñata, 20 feet below the broken, hanging edge of the platform and 150 feet above the churning, unforgiving waves. My left arm was a useless, disconnected appendage, radiating a fire that consumed my entire torso. My right ankle was already beginning to swell to the size of a small melon. "Leo!" Chad's panicked voice, thin and reedy from so far above, sliced through the air. "Oh my God, Leo, are you okay?" "Peachy!" I gritted out through clenched teeth, sweat beading on my forehead and dripping into my eyes. "Just hanging out. How's the view from up there?" "Don't joke! Can you climb?" I tried to pull myself up with my good arm, my right arm. The simple movement sent a wave of nausea and white-hot, electric pain through my dislocated shoulder. The world swam in a gray haze for a moment. "Negative on the climbing, Houston," I gasped, my head lolling back against the cold rock. "We have a problem." Chad's face, pale and wide-eyed with terror, appeared over the broken edge. Okay, don't panic. I'm calling 911. Just hang on." "Don't have much of a choice," I yelled back, a weak attempt at bravado. The wail of sirens was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It grew closer, and then stopped abruptly at the top of the cliff. I could hear shouting from above. The rescue team had arrived. The fire department. The pros. They would get their heavy-duty bolt cutters, slice through Brenda's ridiculous, now infamous lock, set up a proper rope system, and haul me out of here in no time. I'd be sipping a margarita in the ER in an hour. But the shouting continued. In fact, it grew more frantic, more confused. And then I heard her voice. A voice I would recognize in the depths of hell. It was high and shrill and laced with an unshakable, righteous indignation. It was Brenda. "You cannot. This is private HOA property. You do not have authorization to damage that gate. It is a secured boundary." "You have got to be kidding me. You have got to be kidding me." The fire chief, a man whose voice sounded like it was fueled by gravel and 3 decades of unfiltered rage, was yelling back. "Ma'am, there is a man dangling from your neighbor's illegal staircasing. We are coming through that gate, one way or another. You will do no such thing. I have bylaws. Bylaw 7, subsection C, paragraph 4. This was it. Her magnum opus. Her final stand. The hill she was literally, actually willing to let me die on. All in the name of a rule. Then a new voice entered the fray. A voice I knew well. It was calm, it was dead, and it was utterly, completely devoid of patience. It was Officer Miller. "Brenda," he said. And the power in that single word silenced everyone. The firemen stopped shouting. Even the gulls seemed to hold their breath. "You are obstructing an active emergency rescue operation. That is a felony. I am giving you one chance, and one chance only, to step away from this gate." "I will not!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "The rules are the rules. You can't just—" There was a short, pregnant pause. Then Miller spoke again, his voice as crisp and final as a judge's gavel striking the block. "Brenda, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice and felony reckless endangerment. Put your hands behind your back." Even from my dangling, pain-racked perch, I could hear the collective, audible gasp from the assembled neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle. I could hear Brenda's sputtering, her indignant cries of, "Do you know who I am?" and "I will be calling my lawyer." Most satisfyingly of all, I heard the sharp, metallic, unmistakable click of handcuffs being snapped into place. A moment later, there was a loud clang and a screech of protesting metal. The gate was breached. The rescue team rushed in, but as they assessed the situation from the edge, a new problem arose. I could hear them talking, their voices carried down to me on the breeze. The collapse had destabilized the surrounding rock face. The anchors for the remaining parts of the staircase were compromised. A ground-based rope rescue, where they would lower a rescuer down to me, was now deemed too risky. It could trigger another collapse. The fire chief got on his radio. His voice crackled through the air, clear as a bell in the sudden quiet. "Dispatch, this is Engine 42. Situation has changed. We have an unstable cliff face. Ground rescue is a no-go. I'm going to need an aerial extraction. Repeat. Requesting an aerial extraction. Contact County Air Ops. Requesting a helicopter. Preferably a Bell 412 if you have one available." I closed my eyes, my head thudding gently against the rock. And I started to laugh. It was a wheezing, painful, shoulder-agonizing laugh, but it was a laugh nonetheless. The universe, in its infinite and chaotic wisdom, had a sense of humor, a dark, twisted, and exquisitely ironic sense of humor. Brenda had started this whole insane war by forcing me into a helicopter. And now, a helicopter was going to end it by saving me from the consequences of her own criminal stupidity. It was poetic. It was perfect. I woke up to the smell of antiseptic, floor wax, and cheap, lime green jello. My entire left arm was immobilized in a complex sling and swathe contraption. My right ankle was entombed in a thick plaster cast, and my body felt like it had been the loser in a bar fight with a cement mixer. But I was alive, and I was horizontal, which was a definite improvement. Chad was asleep in the uncomfortable-looking visitor's chair next to my bed, his mouth slightly open, a little trail of drool making its way down his chin. And standing at the foot of the bed, looking impossibly pleased with themselves, were Sticks and Stones. "Morning, sunshine," Sticks said cheerfully, his voice a little too loud for the quiet hospital room. "Heard you tested the product's failure points. Bold QA strategy. We brought you a get-well-soon present." He handed me a cheap plastic picture frame from a drugstore. Inside was a grainy cell phone photo, blown up to an 8x10. It was a picture of Brenda, her face a contorted mask of fury and disbelief, being guided gently but firmly into the back of Miller and Davis's patrol car. Davis, in the background, was visibly fighting a grin. "Stones took it," Sticks said proudly. "He's got a real eye for composition. Captures the raw emotion of the moment, you know?" Stones, standing behind him with his arms crossed over his massive chest, just grunted. It was a grunt I now understood to be the highest form of self-congratulation. "It's beautiful," I said, my voice hoarse. "I'll treasure it always." The weeks that followed were a blur of things I don't enjoy. Physical therapy, legal depositions, and being the primary subject of an almost comical amount of neighborhood gossip. The story of my rescue and Brenda's arrest became local legend. Brenda, as it turned out, was facing a raft of very serious charges. The cops had found the crowbar in her garage, with traces of paint from my staircase on it. My drone footage established her pattern of harassment. When faced with the very real prospect of trading her beige house for a state-run beige jumpsuit and staring down the barrel of a civil suit from me that would have made her ancestors weep, she took a plea deal. She got a hefty fine, 5 years of probation, and a court order forcing her to sell her house and move to a different county, preferably one that was landlocked and flat. The HOA, deprived of its iron-fisted ruler, imploded spectacularly. In the power vacuum left by Brenda's spectacular downfall, the terrified homeowners held a chaotic emergency meeting. In the end, they voted to dissolve the old HOA charter and its entire library of insane, multi-volume bylaws. They formed a new, one-page agreement based on the radical Silicon Valley disruptor concept of not being horrible to each other. They even offered me the presidency. I politely declined. I had won the war. I had no interest in governing the peace. Sticks and stones, out of a combination of professional pride and a genuine sense of righteous indignation on my behalf, rebuilt the staircase. They reinforced the anchors, replaced the broken sections, and made the whole thing twice as strong as it was before. They refused to take a single dime for the repair work. "Call it a warranty claim," Sticks had said with a wink. The Leo Gate, as it was now unofficially known throughout the neighborhood, was reinstalled with a new, state-of-the-art electronic lock. A keycard was given to every resident on the cliffside, and a master code was lodged with the local fire department. It became a local landmark, a quiet monument to the absurd lengths one man would go to for a good climb, and the even more absurd lengths another woman would go to stop him. Months later, I was finally healed. The physical therapist had cleared me for light activity, and my shoulder was more bionic than bone at this point. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple. The air was cool and salty. Chad and I stood at the top of the cliff, harnesses on, ropes coiled, ready for our first official descent down the new and improved Operation Downward Dog. It was perfect, strong, elegant, and beautiful. My phone buzzed in the pocket of my climbing pants. An unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "Leo?" a familiar gruff voice asked. "Frank?" I said, a grin spreading across my face. "Frank the pilot, my man! How's the prize-winning pig transportation business?" "Booming," he said gruffly. "Never a dull moment. Listen, I've got a weird one for you. Figured you'd appreciate it. Some lady just called. Wants to know if I can do a simple aerial lift. Something about moving some heavy cast-iron patio furniture to a new condo a few towns over. Says she's on a strict budget, can't afford movers who'll handle the stairs at her new place. Name's Brenda." I looked at Chad. He raised a single, questioning eyebrow. I looked out at the ocean, at the endless expanse of blue stretching out to the horizon. I looked at my staircase, my beautiful, hard-won staircase. A slow, genuine, and deeply satisfying smile spread across my face. "Frank," I said, the laughter bubbling up in my chest, rich and painless. "Tell her I'm available for aerial logistics consulting. And tell her for that particular job, my fee is double." I hung up the phone, clipped my rappel device into the anchor, and took my first step down the staircase. The feud was over. The war was won. Across the way, a "For Sale" sign stood proudly on Brenda's old lawn, a final silent monument to a battle well fought. And the view from the top and all the way down to the bottom had never been better.